Hi everyone. So, I don't know if actually you can see this. It's a function of this program, and I don't know what it's supposed to do. Anyway, so I wanted to look through this essay by George Orwell that I've mentioned called Politics and English Language. It's probably his second most anthologized, generally anthologized essay, next to Shooting an Elephant. And this is an interesting piece. I'm only asking you to read a certain section of it, although I think that it's a good essay to look through because he's identifying in 1945 what has effectively become um, commonplace in both government and media representations of things, and that is to say, euphemism. So we'll talk a little bit about euphemism. We'll talk a little bit about, we'll read through a section of this, and then that will take us through this next essay. And this is a really central essay to what I want you to understand in Orwell's thinking and his general approach to pretty much everything that he writes, and the way that he analyzes and the way that he sees language as effectively central to not just what it means to be human, but also what it means to express oneself as a person. So we will start this. I'm going to pause this, and then we'll come back and begin. So here Orwell is talking about the relationship, obviously that's right there in the title, between politics and language, and how language can be wielded by those with a strong political agenda to corrupt thought, to force upon people ways or to force upon people an orthodox viewpoint, and to disallow for alternative thoughts. This is textbook 101, political manipulation. So I want to read through this section. I'm just going to read it to you so I know that you have seen it from this essay. We'll start right here. I think I had you start reading from here, from 278. But I think that right here is a good place to start. Orwell says, in our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Things like the continuance of the British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face and which do not square with the professed aims of political parties. Thus, political language has to consist largely of euphemism, question begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out to the countryside, the cattle machine gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population, or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial, or shot in the back of the neck, or sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. Consider, for instance, some comfortable English professor defending Russian totalitarianism. He cannot say outright, I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so. Probably, therefore, he will say something like this. Now, that's what he said. That's the intention. Killing your political opponents is okay if it leads to positive results for you. And we would normally say like, wow, that's really brutal. That's too honest. Okay, so listen to just how he clouds that message in this next paragraph. It's really funny. So remember, this is what he's saying. This is what he means. I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so. While freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods, and that the rigors which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement. What? You see that you can't even get through that sentence because it's so cloudy, it's so vague. And remember that this is a time when, in 1945, this is 30 years after the establishment of the Soviet Union. So a little historical context. When he's talking about Russia here, he means the Soviet Union. And basically in 1917 and 18, with the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks came in and took all the land from everybody. They said, nope, it's not yours anymore, it's ours. And they killed people by the tens of millions over the next 40, 50 years. Really, really, really awful. So I will maybe talk a little bit more about that maybe when we get to Animal Farm. But that's a little sketch of what he's talking about. The Russian people. So this is killing off your political opponents is what I want to do. And in Russia, that meant basically any opponent of Stalin, Joseph Stalin. So anyway, the inflated style is itself a kind of euphemism. A mass of Latin words falls upon the facts like soft snow, blurring the outlines and covering up all the details. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. Keep that sentence in mind. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish squirting out ink. In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. When the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer. I should expect to find, this is a guess which I have not sufficient knowledge to verify, that the German, Russian, and Italian languages have all deteriorated in the last 10 or 15 years as a result of dictatorship. But if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. That is effectively, that's the thesis statement of this essay by Orwell. If you had to pin it on one sentence, it's right there. Thought can corrupt language. Language can corrupt thought. Why? Because language is the medium in which we think and thereby express ourselves, right? So here he is talking about euphemism, and this is going to be one of the main points for the midterm and final. We're going to look into Orwell's essays and tease out how he's using euphemism in these essays to effectively establish his point or what he's talking about. As a note here, this word euphemism. Now, euphemism is something that we do very commonly. When the word euphemism comes from the Greek eu and pheme, which means good, and then this would be a derivation of the verb. I can't remember the verb off the top of my head, but basically it just means speaking, and so we get euphemism. So good speaking. Okay, it's related. For example, our word blaspheme comes from the same derivation in Greek, but from the word blapto or blapta, which means to injure. So injurious or injuring speaking. So when you blaspheme, you are injuring with your words, with your speech. Here you are speaking good about a potentially negative subject. Now, euphemisms they tend to be used for uncomfortable subjects. So a lot of the time, it's basically just death and sex. So there's a lot of metaphors or phrases or euphemisms that we use. Passed away. Instead of she died, we would say like, oh, she passed away. She's with God now. Those are euphemisms. Okay. They're also metaphors, but it's a euphemistic type of speech. Now, remember that for Orwell, style that style that he's writing in there, that can be a type of euphemism. Okay, the language is so twisted around on itself that it's hard to pin down, like, what is this author actually talking about. So just to show you this, so in Korean, their word jeep, which means house. Korean doesn't really have a word like we do for home. So we have house, right? But then we also have that sense of home, right? Which is like that's where your loved ones are. That's where you are most comfortable. So you can have a house is not necessarily a home, right? So Korean doesn't have that, and so for them to approximate our notion of home, right? They would have to either add words or add a metaphor to it. They would have to add. So there's no direct correlation. Now English has the largest vocabulary of any language because we borrow so heavily from so many languages. English is a pretty flexible language and can accommodate a lot of grammar changes, grammar irregularities, and so it's that's why it's probably the world's among many reasons, but it's why we're lucky in speaking English natively because most people around the world have to accommodate English to some degree. So just to show you this, like in Spanish, casa, which means house, they don't have a word for home either necessarily. But there was an interesting etymology. I was pointing this out to a friend of mine who grew up bilingual in English and Spanish, and I said, oh, well, look at casa and casar, which means to marry. So in marrying, you are housing, right? So that they're tied together. So to marry is to join together and have that house. So casa, in this sense, has this perhaps implied secondary meaning or underpinning that nudges it a little bit toward home, maybe. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting. I like etymology. Yeah. So in speaking of Korea there, and just to kind of add to this, because like I said, I used to live there. It's a place that's near and dear to my heart. And for, I think it's about 20 years, Japan had occupied Korea in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1920s through the 1940s. And what would happen was they had implemented laws that made Korean illegal. And so they were trying to use their power to erase the Korean language. And it was illegal to speak, it was illegal to learn, it was illegal to write. And so if you go to Korea now and you talk to some of the older people, their Korean is not as good as their Japanese because they didn't grow up learning Korean. They grew up learning Japanese. And so that is one way to effectively control people, right? Well, you speak Japanese, you must be Japanese. You're not Korean because Korea, right, doesn't exist. If we can erase that language, and it's as subversive as it sounds. In Cambodia, quick history lesson. In Cambodia, there was a guy named Pol Pot, and he was head of this group called the Khmer Rouge. And in the 1970s, primarily because of the Vietnam War, Cambodia's government became destabilized, and the Khmer Rouge, they were a communist organization, took over the country. And they killed a third of the population, either by starving them to death, working them to death, or executing them in the next 8, 9 years. Well, during this period, they basically forced everybody out of cities into these collective farms and made everybody work, between 17 to 20 hours a day. And, they gave them a cup of rice a day. Starvation was rampant. And they made the words rest and sleep illegal. So you weren't allowed to say those words. And this is the power of language, because if we erase this word that categorizes an idea metaphorically or otherwise, right? How do we find our way to understanding that thing, right? It takes more effort, perhaps, to then describe the idea or thing that we're talking about. So if I can point to something and I don't have a word for it, right? I don't have a category of understanding it. There's no definition sitting behind it that says, that's what that thing is. So, for example, if you had a friend who came from a Spanish-speaking country, and you said the word home, and they said, no entiendo, how would you explain that? You see that we have that home just catches the definition automatically if you know what the word means. So this is what euphemisms do. Here, there's a certain irony in how Orwell is addressing them, because the original definition, eufeme, speaking well about something, has a positive connotation. We don't want to drum up negative associations, right? When we talk about things like death. It's a very sensitive subject. Well, what about in politics? What about political euphemism? That is injurious speaking. It's almost blasphemy, right? Because what we're doing is we're trying to hide the actual intent or actual meanings behind these words. So looking here, this is a random list of euphemisms that I had. I have not upgraded this for a while, but these are all still more or less used. So here's some euphemisms. Like if you say like you're bombing somewhere, killing people, you wouldn't say we're bombing. The script say, we operated a surgical strike, right? Surgical strike, that sounds way different. That sounds even good, right? Surgery, although scary, right, aims to make people healthy. Here we have the opposite of making people healthy. I've heard this recently. I don't know why, but unalive. I don't know why people say that now, but you kill. You killed. Smart bombs. Sure, bombs can be, precision guided, but they can't be smart. Same with a phone, right? So even like saying smartphone, that's a euphemism. Okay. Collateral damage is when you're trying to kill one group of people and you kill innocent people. Right? Those innocent people are deemed collateral damage. You don't say, we killed a bunch of innocent people that we didn't mean to. You say, there was some collateral damage. Extraordinary rendition. Wait, I forgot one. I am going to call the police on that guy and his motorcycle. Anyway, extraordinary rendition is when a government arrests one of its own citizens when they're outside of the country. We call that an extraordinary rendition. So we went in, we arrested one of our own citizens, usually for secret reasons that they don't want to disclose. So they say, where's an extraordinary rendition? Binocular deprivation. This is when, let's say, you're doing animal testing and you are testing the effects of a chemical or drug on the eyes of living things, and like they test on animals. So they would they would see how much chemical they could put into the animal's eyes before it went blind. That is binocular deprivation. Biosolids, that's sewage. So no sewage. That sounds gross. Biosolids, it's okay. I can't quite figure out what that's referring to. To depopulate, I'm sure you can imagine what that is. in terms of I forget exactly where the term would be used, but basically it would either, I mean, if it's used about humans, it means to kill them. But if it's used with animals, basically it means to kill off large groups of certain animals in certain areas for usually business reasons. Normal involuntary attrition, that means getting fired. So if you say, oh, well, we didn't fire this person, and they were simply a casualty of normal involuntary attrition. And that's so weird sounding, you can't even figure that out. Budget reinforcement, taxes. So taxes are a form of budgetary reinforcement. Public diplomacy. I've seen this one in reference to propaganda. So we think of propaganda, right, negatively. But public diplomacy, diplomacy is a good thing. If it's public, right, we can all see it. Oh, that's a good thing. Well, I don't know. Uninstalled, that's another one for fired. They were uninstalled from their position. Transfer tubes, those would be body bags. So this is, I don't know if this is British. It sounds British to me, but it came up when I was doing my original notes on this. Enhanced interrogation techniques. This was one that was used about 20 years ago with the Bush administration in the U.S., and they were torturing people in these black sites, right, that nobody knew about. They didn't know where they would do an extraordinary rendition on people. They would put them in these what they call black sites, right, because you don't know where they are, and they would torture them. And so they would do things like waterboarding them, which is illegal according to international law. Like, you can't do that to somebody to try to coerce a confession or information from them. You just can't do it. There are certain forms of torture that are legal, such as sleep deprivation. So they'll put you in a room and they'll keep the lights on. They'll play loud music at random intervals. So the moment you think you're going to fall asleep, they shock you back awake. And after a while, you start to lose your mind, right? Because you need sleep. Waterboarding is basically where, and anyway, I would tell you a story, but in my official capacity, I shouldn't. The waterboarding is when they take you, they tie you down, and in real waterboarding, you're not flat. Your head is down, right, from your feet, so the blood, right, is coming up in your head, and they put a towel over your face and they pour water on it. Now, this doesn't sound bad at first, okay, but after a while, what happens is the water, because you think you can just blow air, after a while though, water starts to get into your nose, and you can't blow it out fast enough, and it literally starts to fill up your sinuses. And so it's a very strange sensation, and so it tricks your brain into thinking that you're drowning. And so people will start to panic, and you're not drowning, right? You're not drowning in this position. Your brain gets so confused, though, because this is a completely strange and new situation, that you think you're drowning, and then they stop, take the towel off, and they say, okay, where's the gold? Say, oh, you'll never take me alive, and then they do it again and again and again. They did this, I think, to one prisoner 300 times. So instead of calling it torture, they call it enhanced interrogation techniques, which sounds, okay, well, if it's an enhanced, right, that's got to be good. Interrogation, that's just questioning, and techniques, that's also a good thing. So you see that these euphemisms are still being used. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look back into Orwell's essays for euphemisms. And this will be the basis for the midterm. Okay, we're going to identify euphemisms in Orwell, and then we're going to try to understand what is he doing with those euphemisms. But that's what Orwell identifies as very dangerous, because these euphemisms can be used to obscure, you know, terrible actions. They can also obscure understanding of certain things, right? And so when we think back to what he's identifying as tyrannic versus democratic weapons, right? Can we not call euphemism a certain type of tyrannical weapon? You see, we're trying to build this idea of seeing language being used in this way, and Orwell was always trying to warn us about that. So, anyway, that is euphemism as far as Orwell would have it. So, next, and that's from Politics and the English Language. Next, I'm going to sketch in some of his attitudes from his books. Okay, just to kind of to give some context to what Orwell was doing. So, thank you.